Hey everybody, welcome to what is the very first part of a new CE series that we're doing, which is Houses by the Era. As we were doing the research and developing these presentations, we realized that the history was actually important and that it matters because it determines where houses were built, what materials they were built out of, and quite honestly, for a history nerd like me, it's just plain fascinating. So we wanted to pass on kind of what we found, give you guys a sneak peek, see if you had any feedback on it. So let's talk a little bit about the history of Central Indiana here, and that will go into why we built houses where we did, what we built them out of, all of that kind of stuff. So
Yeah,
let's jump into it.
it'll definitely help us have a deeper understanding of the century. And so, welcome to this little passion project that Matt and I have. But basically, it all started with the transportation revolution here in Indiana. And there were three parts to this, but the first part was actually what was the Cumberland Road and then later known as the National Highway.
So three really cool things to know about the Cumberland Road. Congress fought over the funding of it for years, so some things never change. It was actually the first major road that was paved with gravel and not with logs, and it still exists today. It's US Highway 40, runs right through Hancock County here, right through Greenfield. It's obviously not still paved with gravel, but the road itself still exists.
Well, 200 years later, we're dealing with potholes, but hey.
True.
Second part of the transportation revolution is actually railroads, which are originally used by workers to get their goods from one area to the other. And then just in 50 years, we were able to cross the country, which basically it really brought profound social and economic and political change to the nation.
Yeah, and our very first railroads, interestingly, were actually horse-drawn, so not pulled by the big locomotives that everybody pictures. And the other really interesting tidbit that we found out here is that the Transcontinental Railroad, which was, completed in 1869 at Promontory Point, Utah, with the Golden Spike, actually wasn't transcontinental until several years after that, when they finally finished building railroad bridges across the Missouri River.
Done those waterways, but waterways is the third part of the transportation revolution. And for Indiana, it was the Wabash Canal, which started up north near Lake Erie and then all the way down to Evansville, Indiana. And it crossed through pretty prominent towns.
Yeah, the Wabash and Erie was actually the longest canal in the country at the time, and canals in general were a huge part of our transportation infrastructure, at least the first half of the 19th century.
So we'll just wrap up this little topic of the transportation revolution. But basically, the cool thing was that Indiana was one of the most advanced states in the Midwest due to our technology and advancements with transportation. Uh, from the beginning of the century to the end, it impacted healthcare, education, social activities. Just amazing all the things that it took, it impacted. But the biggest one was actually work. So before the Civil War, you can imagine what families were doing. Very little house on the prairie. They were taking care of making their own clothing, their own soaps, their own food. And then by the end of the century, there were burgeoning factories and factory towns.
Yeah, we made everything in the world here in the Midwest in the 1800s, and the list of products, if you go through them, is absolutely amazing.
So if you can imagine it, the first half of the century was farmland, but then in the second half, burgeoning factory towns like the Ball Corporation, I didn't realize moved from New York to Muncie, Indiana to take advantage of the cheap natural gas there.
Yeah, nobody realizes it today, but Indiana actually had quite a bit of production of oil and natural gas in the 19th century. And if you guys have ever driven up I-69 towards Fort Wayne, the Gas City exit, despite what your kids will laugh about, is actually named for all of the natural gas production that took place here in the 1800s. And like Liz said, the reason the Ball Corporation moved here from New York was to take advantage of that cheap and abundant natural gas supply. And we actually still produce quite a bit of oil in the southern half of the state, but that natural gas production kind of petered out by the end of the 1800s.
And then the other cool thing was just advancements in textile machinery meant that people weren't actually making their own sheets and cloth from home, but these factories were able to employ individuals. So by 1870, there were 2,400 woolen mills, and this is one of those woolen mills that was in Indiana. Matt,
Yeah, I had no idea, but people would actually do that weaving at home and then take that to the mills to be processed further into clothes and things like that.
Matt already talked a little bit about the Indiana gas boom, but by 1898, the Trenton gas field had exhausted its supply of gas. There are other factories. There was the Fort Wayne knitting mills, Wayne knitting mills in Fort Wayne. Where was it, Matt, where they made band instruments? Was it around Elkhart?
I always want to say Elkhart, but that could be Campers later on in the 20th century as well. But yeah, there were manufacturing centers, specialized manufacturing centers for all kinds of things in Indiana at that time, including band instruments and all kinds of stuff you wouldn't think of today.
So it was just really cool that people had access to healthier diets, better housing, and cheaper goods, and all because of that industrial revolution, but then also the transportation revolution. And then something that we can all relate to today is just how education was transformed. It wasn't until 1848 that Indiana started the process to have public schools. And Matt, you know a little bit about the history of the private seminaries and the private tuition, the private learning before 1848?
Yeah, if you've ever visited the schoolhouse at Conner Prairie, you know that education up until about the middle of the 1800s here was actually small and private and paid for out of pocket by families and occasionally communities. It wasn't until the mid 1800s that we began to formalize a public education system here, which more or less resembles what we have now. So
Right.
public education is a relatively modern innovation.
So yeah, a primary school was built in each of the 7 wards of Indianapolis that were in existence in the mid 1800s. And then as Marion County developed and other areas were annexed into what would be IPS now, they then became newly created wards of the school. So in addition to education, health was definitely transformed. Here's really 2 cool things: smallpox vaccine and the discovery of bacteria. So Edward Jenner was doing tests on the 9-year-old son of his gardener and one of the milkmaids. And that is how he discovered smallpox, which I thought was pretty cool. And then we can thank Louis Pasteur and pasteurization and wine on his summer holiday for the discovery of bacteria.
It's always amazing when you do this research that the biggest problems are solved for the smallest reasons. So somebody trying to improve the taste and quality of their wine at their summer home leads to something like pasteurization.
And then what would we do or be without some of these things just helping us? Communication had significant advances. Braille, Morse code, the telephone, typewriters, zippers. I mean, I know that isn't communication, but Matt, what is your favorite one here?
My favorite one out of all of these is the zipper, because the guy who actually patented it didn't think it would ever amount to anything, and he never commercially exploited that patent.
And what would we do today? How would we hold up jeans without zippers today? Well, so that brings us to the end. I hope you have enjoyed this. As Matt said earlier, we're developing this into a CE class. So if you have any information, maybe you have family history in the 1800s, maybe you've shown a late 1800s home to your clients and you have some cool stories, we would love to hear that from you. And then Matt, you're going to be talking about these things next week.
Yeah, next week we'll start to get a little more specific on houses and geek out a little bit over some of the materials we used to build houses in the 1800s, many of which are still in use today. We use steel, glass, lumber, masonry. So the 1800s house is really the genesis of our houses today. So we'll go back and we'll explore a little bit of the history of that, and we'll start talking about why houses are built out of the materials they're built out of.
And then just throughout this year, we're going to be teaching you more and learning with you on houses by the period. So just stay tuned.